In this latest episode of Risk Engineers Talk Governance, due diligence engineers Richard Robinson and Gaye Francis talk about the contest of ideas and ask if Australia has gone backwards regarding embracing SFAIRP method. We hope you enjoy the episode. If you do, please give us a rating. Also subscribe on your favourite podcast platform, and please do check out the other episodes. If you have any feedback, please let us know. All details for Richard and Gaye are in the description of the podcast.
Hi, Richard.
Hi, Gaye.
Welcome to another session or recording of our podcast. Today we're going to talk about something a bit different that we really haven't talked about in our podcast before, and that's around the contest of ideas.
That's quoting John Howard from 2017 when he pointed out politics is supposed to be about the contest of ideas and not a public relations exercise.
And we're sort of talking about it in the context of we've been doing a bit of soul searching lately about what R2A is and what we're doing and where we're going. And I think the key thing that R2A has really prospered from over the years is that thought leadership stuff in the risk and due diligence space.
Correct.
And where we've been and where we've come from and where we're going, I guess, as the most important things. And I think there's been some observations, especially after COVID and the way that business is done after COVID. We thought we'd all be back to normal, whatever that normal was, and pre-COVID conditions by now.
Yep.
But I think business has really changed forever. I'm not sure that we'll ever get back to the way that business was done prior to COVID.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors in that we're not too sure about. But see, one of the things we've noticed that people aren't, well, for example, buying books the way they used to. At best, they absorb things online. Everything's become a lot more short-termism. I don't know what you've quite the way to put it, but everything comes in short, sharp snaps now. You don't buy. Reading War and Peace was probably never a particularly popular exercise, but it's only something that some of us did some of the time.
I think it's called a now society, which my children are very much about a now society. We want it now and we don't want to wait for anything. And if it doesn't give your attention for if you need attention for more than 5 minutes, then that's about it.
Yep.
But everything wants to be, you're right, easily accessible, and people want it now, the information
Correct.
now.
And they want the solution now too. Now, as we've commented, thinking is hard, and if you can get it now, why bother?
Very much so. So I think in terms of where we are as risk, we always say we're risk and due diligence engineers and due diligence engineers, but I think due diligence has really gone into the governance space.
Yes. And as we just pointed out, this governance space is up with John Clark, would be particularly pleased for you to use.
So the space of governance, and you use due diligence, I guess, to demonstrate that you have been, that you're showing governance in areas of safety, projects, operations,
and
all of those
that's precisely where our two little new books were aimed at. They were aimed at the governance space in those two particular domains, which were therefore extracts out of the larger R2A text.
So I'm not exactly sure what's happening, but we do seem to be spinning wheels at the moment in the risk space anyway. And I think even the ideas that Australia embraced 10 years ago around the SFAIRP methodology and things like that, I think we've gone backwards.
I think that's correct. And we've been trying to figure out why that might be the case. To some extent, we're putting it down to Brexit and a sudden influx of English colleagues and relying on the notion that the UK Health and Safety Executives, ALARP and SFAIRP, are the same thing, which is absolutely quite fascinating. And it's certainly true, and we've had lawyers tell this to us. I mean, in the WHS and OHS legislation, for example, they only define reasonably practicable. They say you've got to eliminate risk so far as reasonably practicable, and if you can't eliminate it, to reduce it so far as reasonably practicable. But the legislation only defines reasonably practicable. And we've always noted, quite correctly, that if every reasonable practical precaution is in place, then the risk associated with the hazard will be as low as reasonably practicable. The difficulty we've always had is that the process you use to do these two things is quite different, and that if you do use the hazard and risk-based approach to demonstrate
As low as reasonably
practicable, you come up with a different list of recommendations and an effort and a whole lot of things involved than if you go around the way that's required in the WHS legislation. It's the basic engineering philosophy observation. The means and the method results are only consequences. Depending on which method you use, you will get different results.
And I think that's what the Health and Safety Executive said in the UK, wasn't it? That the basis of the two concepts is reasonably practical.
Yep.
But they are different. I'm not sure about WHS or work health and safety legislation in the UK, whether they actually define it the same way that we do.
Oh, they do. No, the 1974 Act has got SFAIRP in the legislation.
Right. But then as other practitioners say, you know, how can you say that the two are the same when they've been defined for different purposes by different groups of people? And the way that you'll be tested in the courts after the event is the SFAIRP approach. So courageous is one of the words that we would use to say.
The yes minister term, yes. Now, to that extent, and in the contest of ideas, R2A sort of, we've tended to walk around this in a polite way. And what we've noticed is in order to get people to think our way, we have to get the lawyers on side first. And we've never had any great problem doing that. Although beating people over the head with lawyers is not necessarily the best way to start a starting position in life. But what we've basically sort of concluded, we're going a bit further than that. There are now so many standards that contradict the WHS legislation completely, that it's setting organisations up for fall. The ones that notably we talk about are ISO 31000, the risk management standard. And since that's mandated by government in all sorts of places, the fact that it actually stops people from actually demonstrating so far stuns us. But ISC 6158, the Functional Safety Assessment Standard, it still uses target levels of risk and safety. You're not allowed to do that. 5577, the network standard, that one's a classic because it's in one paragraph. It says you shall eliminate hazards so far as reasonably practicable. And if you can't eliminate them, you use them as low as reasonably practicable in the one paragraph. It's just unbelievable. And then you've got 2885, the pipeline standard. We've had lots of discussions with the pipeline people, and I have to say their ALAP is looking suspiciously like so far, but they've still got the confusion with the terms. And EG0, there's another blindingly complicated one. We've been sort of complaining about that for the last 10 years. And we don't quite understand, because if you actually contradict the Act, you can't go around having standards contradicting Act. And that means Standards Australia and the Board of Standards Australia really needs to get its act together. And from our point of view, Engineers Australia needs to pick up the Board of Standards Australia. The whole point of the Engineers Australia Safety Case Guideline is to point out what you needed to do.
To demonstrate diligence.
As engineers. And since that's your intellectual body telling you, if you go with an Australian standard and ignoring the Engineers Australia Code of Practice, as far as I know, engineers are setting themselves up for a colossal legal fall. But people are doing these things.
I think also that people are using the standards as license to trade. And when your regulator's asking you to do one thing, and, you know, but people have stopped thinking just because a regulator tells you to do one thing doesn't mean that all of those other obligations that you're required to do disappear.
And our experience is that regulators don't get it right regularly.
And there's no downfall for them either. There's no...
Well, they might be publicly embarrassed when it goes wrong, but it's the organisation that suffers, and the board, and the relevant board, that suffers the legal test.
So I think there's a lot of wheel churning and wheel spinning going on, because it's creating so much work for organisations to do that they're just missing the picture of the big picture of the things that they really need to do to get on with doing their business safely. Correct.
And we're sort of agog. I mean, from our point of view, due diligence is a governance exercise. You can't always be right, but what the courts demand of you is that you're always diligent. And that's why, you know, we have suggested on a number of occasions in the past, for example, the Risk Engineering Society should become the Due Diligence Engineering Society, because that is the legal duty of engineers.
To be diligent.
To be diligent. There's never been the duty to be risk engineers. The duty is to be due diligent engineers.
And I think just going on from the risk as well, it's you've got to make sure that you're addressing the vulnerability, what can actually, you know, be negative, what can actually negatively impact your business, rather than just the threat per se.
Yes. Well, that was Bob Browning, one of our previous associates, spent a lot of time explaining this from a security point of view. It's not the threat that counts. It's how you're vulnerable to the threat that counts. And we just had an interesting conversation this morning with the Water Authority to the effect that we're not entirely sure, but that distinction between the threat and where you're actually vulnerable, and that you have to demonstrate due diligence for that vulnerability, is what you need to do. Sometimes just because of the practical application. You will address the threat, but that's not always the way that it's done.
I think the example there was climate change, wasn't it? So, climate change is obviously a threat to many organisations, or is a threat, upcoming risk. But how does it actually impact your business going forward? And what implications does that have for your business or consequences? And that's what you need to address in terms of the resilience and the availability of your system that you're going forward with.
Correct. And I think that was the other thing which was interesting in the conversation was, you see, the engineers have basically made a feast for hazard and risk analysis for the last 30 years. But there's a lot of other different ways to go about this. And the really weird thing about this risk business, I think we've talked about this before, none of the techniques that people apply are in error. They will all give insight. It's just that this risk thing, this risk space, is a multi-dimensional creature, and you can slice and dice it in all sorts of different ways, and you will get different insight. Where the system's coming unstuck, so far as we can tell, is that people aren't thinking through what is the analysis type they need to get the answer that they require in order to demonstrate in governance terms that they've been diligent.
And by getting different insight, they will give you different insight, as you said. But what's the most useful insight? And I think in doing that, you also now have to understand what some of the downfalls for each of the techniques are.
Yes.
Some have different they all have different benefits, but you've got to understand the pitfalls of those techniques as well going forward, so you know what the limitations are and what aspects may be missing from that understanding.
Well, that's just coming back to the standards business. And there's that quote I give you from the 1937, I can't remember which one it was, Chairman of Victoria Division of Engineers Australia, who pointed out that standards have two purposes in life: to prevent fools from their folly and rogues from their roguery. And so far as I can tell, the points he was trying to make was, you're meant to think through from first principles as an engineer competently how it ought to be, and then you test back against the standards to make sure you haven't done anything stupid. Even the standards I'm complaining about that miss the point of the WHS legislation doesn't mean to say they're entirely in error. There's lots of good bits and pieces in there. Because remember, it's not a standard that's recognised good practice, it's the relevant ideas in the standard that's recognised good practice. But the first one, that's fools from their folly. And practically, if you're trying to hang a contractor who's hashed up a job, the quickest way to do it is to say, you're rotten sod, you haven't complied with the standard, you're toast. Well, that's rogues and their roguery. But you never want to go there. You want to get it right the first time. Diligence doesn't mean you're hanging people. Diligence means you get it right initially.
And I think that's the key thing about the due diligence process. It's supposed to get you to enable you to get on with things and make things happen, which is what engineers are about, making. And
due diligence makes things happen. Risk analysis stops things from occurring.
That's correct. And I think we had lunch with an associate a couple of weeks ago, and said due diligence is really about, it's the laxity that makes things happen more smoothly. I hadn't quite thought about due diligence engineers in that way, but
True.
That was a very interesting analogy. And it is, it's supposed to make things happen and get on with things. You've only got limited resources, limited time, limited budget. And what is the best option or optimal option going forward to achieve the things that you want to achieve? So that's why it's super critical to identify what you're trying to achieve, what are the options to get there, and what are the best ones in those circumstances.
Which is what the WHS legislation requires of you. We don't get why people use the risk management standard in contradiction to the legislation. To us, this is more than just courageous, because this is willfully doing it. The fact that government agencies demand the risk management standard process when the WHS legislation specifically tells you not to do it is proper reflection on the code of practice, which is also an error. But I think that's the subject of another podcast.
I think that might be the subject of another podcast. So we've done a bit of a venting session today and just the frustrations of where things are at. But there is a lot of confusion out there, and I think it feels like industry has gone backwards with the acceptance of SFAIRP going forward, and the processes that were being implemented are now being eroded, I think, and there's been a lot more emphasis on quantitative risk assessment.
Using target levels of risk.
Using target levels of risk and trying to characterise it. And as we've said on many, many occasions in our podcast, and anyone that's ever listened to us before, you ask two risk experts to go and characterise the risk associated with something, and you'll always come up with two answers. So which is the right answer?
And it's always better to be roughly right than exactly wrong, which happens a lot.
So all that we would say going forward in this is be careful of standards.
Think.
You need to think these things through. There's a whole lot of tools and techniques out there that are useful techniques, but you have to understand the limitations of it. And it's not a one-size-fits-all tick box exercise when it comes to due diligence and governance.
And when it comes to the crunch, and you're an engineer, a code of practice from Engineers Australia, your intellectual body, unless the standard is called up by statute or regulation, the code of practice from your intellectual body will always have a higher standing in court than an Australian standard.
So thank you for joining us this afternoon. We hope you found it interesting, and we hope that you can join us next time. Have a great afternoon. Bye.
Thanks, Gaye. Bye.